All right, I've got an update on the 74Z1 project. Not the update I wanted to give, but it's the update that we've got. So, I got the bike running on Friday night, and there was actually a car show on Saturday, so I stayed up really late to get the bike finished. We got all the paintwork back. That all came out really good. Bike looked good. And honestly, it fired right up instantly. So I put fuel in it, turned the choke on, and it fired way quicker than what I thought. Like the first couple revolutions, the engine started, and it started for a second, stalled. I went ahead and pulled it out of the garage, let it run for about 5 minutes. Honestly, sounded pretty good. I had to adjust the idle a little bit on the carburetor, and I had a couple oil leaks. So that was the other thing. So I addressed the oil leaks, and then I went up and down the drive, just like a block or two each direction. Sounded good that night, put it away, and got up early the next morning. Drove it about a mile to the car show, and honestly, it rode great. It sounded really good. The carburetors definitely did need balancing, so that was next on my list. And then I knew when I got home, I was going to pull the valve cover and recheck all the clearances, and I wanted to look at the cam bearings because these cam bearings made me nervous from the beginning, but we'll get to that in a second. So on my way home, I had turned on my street, and I literally at this point, the bike hasn't gone over 3,000 RPM. I was just taking it real easy. We had about 20 minutes of runtime on it. So I ran first gear up to like 4,000 RPM, shifted into second, ran second up to about probably 5,500, not quite 6,000 RPM. And just, I don't know if I let off or if it shut off as I let off, but just as I let off or just after I let off, the bike just shut off. Back tire skidded and my heart sunk. I just pulled in the clutch and honestly, I coasted right up to my driveway. Got to the end of the driveway, pushed it in the garage. And I'm just sitting there for a few minutes trying to decompress, thinking this thing just blew up. So at that point, I figured it's already screwed. So I just bumped the starter and the engine turned over and it sounded normal. I bumped it again, it fired up. So I'm like, oh, what just happened? I'm like, all right, I guess it didn't blow up. So I let it run for about 10 seconds. Grabbed Jamie, had her come out and listen if I could restart it again just to make sure she doesn't hear something that I didn't. Started it again. Bike sounded perfectly fine. Let it run for 10 seconds, shut it off. I'm like, hey, we've got racing to do. We're going to put this thing in the garage and we'll address this on Sunday. So Sunday, I came out here honestly in a pretty good mood thinking we dodged a bullet, must have been ignition, something else didn't lock up. So I pulled the valve cover off and started inspecting it, and initially everything looked good. The first thing I looked at was cam bearings. I wanted to see if any of the cam bearings spun. And the reason was, when I got these cam bearings, I installed them on the bench with the head off, and when I would go to torque down the caps would not torque down and set flush with these bearings. The bearings were too tall. So then that made me take a deep dive on these cam bearings. And I got these cam bearings from Z1 Enterprises. Not throwing shade, but kind of throwing shade because I'm going to tell you these things are junk. So I did a deep dive and found someone else this winter that bought these cam bearings and they had spun a cam bearing on initial startup. So when I found that this winter, I went through and checked bearing clearance on every single one of these bearings before I installed them, and I had to address the fact that the cap wouldn't set flush. So what I did is I would file a little bit off the bearing, retorque the cap, recheck it, file a little bit off the bearing, retorque the cap, and I was putting a feeler gauge underneath the caps and literally like 2,000ths to see what kind of bearing crunch I was getting. So I just kept doing that until I got proper bearing crunch. And then, after I was done with all that, I went through and plastic gauged every journal. It took hours to do that. I had way more time in these bearings than what they were ever worth. But if you go online and look for these Z1s and KZs, basically from what I can tell, everyone's selling the same bearings. You can't get, let me see if I can find the other bearings. You cannot get the old style bearings anymore. So this is, it's got hair and stuff all over it, but this is an aftermarket bearing. It says OC, and then it says standard on this side. This bearing was never an issue in this bike, but you can see this bearing's got some trash in it. So the bike had a full set of these, never had a single issue. I can install all the used ones I have of these. It torques down fine, caps set flush, everything's good. These are the new style aftermarket bearings. And they don't say anything on the back. And the chamfer on this hole is a little different. And this right here, the tang that holds the bearing, is actually smaller. It doesn't stick out as much. So there's this one. And here is this one. It's quite a big difference. This is also an aftermarket bearing, but this one's no longer available. I don't know who makes these. They're garbage. I can also show you. Got quite the mess going on. The bearing on the left is an original Kawasaki bearing that I just pulled out of another head. That is got all the original standard Kawasaki bearing marks. If you look at the gap at the top of the tang, you can see that distance. Now look at it on the bearing on the right. You've got double the distance, which means you literally have half of much tang holding the bearing. The one on the right is the Z1 Enterprises bearing. That's a problem. Now, it's my fault for using this bearing, but I could not find any options but these bearings, and that is what it is. We're kind of past that at this point. So I just wanted to show you guys what I was dealing with there. So I went through, I checked all the clearances, got this thing apart though, and obviously knew we had a problem. What I had found, as soon as I pulled it apart, is sure enough, it spun this cam bearing. This is one of those other aftermarket cam bearings in there right now. And as soon as I seen that, again, my heart just sunk. I was sick to my stomach. I just had to regroup. So I came back today, pulled the cam out, and am assessing the damage. So I'll show you what I found now. I know I'm kind of skipping around a bit. So this is the damage to the cam, and it's pretty bad. So this is an Andrews 3X cam, which they don't make anymore, and they're darn near impossible to find. That, I don't know if it's fixable or not. It would have to be welded and then the journal ground back down. Maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, I can find someone to do that. But that's a big issue. Then also on the cylinder head itself, it had also damaged the journal. I do think it might be possibly, as you can see, this bearing fits pretty tight still, so that's good. You can see that damage there where the tang grabbed and stopped, so it turned the bearing about 90 degrees. What we can also see is it was just barely grabbing. That tang didn't take off hardly any material because that tang wasn't grabbing hardly any material. But really and truly, that shouldn't matter too much because the tang is just there to hold the bearing. The bearing spins because either lack of oil or you've got too tight of a clearance. We had too tight of a clearance, and I can show you why, or where, I should say. If we look at the bearing itself, the bearing looks fine everywhere to the right. But everywhere to the left is where it actually gouged in and grabbed. So one or two things happened here. Either this bearing was tapered So when I checked clearance, I put the plastic gauge in the center. I should have caught it, but I didn't, because, to be honest, I was just putting the plastic gauge in the center. So I didn't lay it all the way across the journal. And some of them I did, but clearly I didn't here. That's one theory. My only other theory would be is if this tang wasn't holding the bearing very well, the bearing turned, this tang folded inward, and then that's where all this damage happened, because all the damage does line up with this tang that's broke. So if the bearing turned a little bit, folded that tang over, now that tang is stuck to the bearing, and then that's what caused all of our damage. It's one of the two. Either this bearing's tapered, didn't have enough clearance here, tore it up, or the tang folded over, got in between, contaminated it, and tore it up. Either way, everything I see here tells me all of our problems were caused by these freaking bearings. And it's just what makes sense. I mean, guys have ran these bikes for the last 50 years, and spinning cam bearings isn't a thing. Well, these bearings weren't available, honestly, even 8 years ago. 8 years ago, you could still get the old bearings. So found another guy, like I said, that had the exact same issue. Makes me definitely think to not buy. I don't care if they say they're great, whatever they say, just try to find either good original bearings or new old stock original bearings. Do not buy these particular bearings for sure, that have no writing on the back of them at all, and they have a small tang that doesn't grab. So that's kind of the lesson there. But what sucks is, kind of a lot of things suck about this. One thing that sucks is I kind of knew it in the back of my mind. I knew these bearings were potentially an issue, and where I got hung up is, A, I'd already spent $200 on them, which I thought was ridiculous to begin with. Again, that's my problem. And then B, I didn't have any other options. There wasn't any used bearings out there at the time. There wasn't any new old stock bearings out there at the time. So this was literally my only option. Now, I should have just stopped at that point and done some digging and contacted kind of anyone and everyone I knew and try to find some good used bearings, or kind of piece together a set of new old stock bearings. I do think that's possible to do, but I still don't have an avenue to do that. I'm going to have to take some time to try to figure that out. But yeah, very, 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 very unfortunate, and definitely somewhat self-inflicted. I should have never used these bearings. I just knew better. And it kind of leads to another topic. I mean, we are seeing so many Chinese copies of good parts, like AC Delco spark plugs is an example. I've seen them. I work on cars for a living. People will get AC Delco spark plugs off Amazon, and they're not AC Delco spark plugs. They look like AC Delco spark plugs. They say AC Delco, but they are not. And I got a feeling that's what's going on with these bearings, is someone is selling these bearings to all these suppliers, telling them that they're something, and they're not. They're just some Chinese knockoff bearing. That's my opinion on all that. Now that ranting's over, I've got to come up with a game plan to fix this thing. Like I said, I'm hoping and thinking that this journal will be savable with just a little bit of kind of emery cloth. And then my thought is getting either used original Kawasaki bearings or a different set of aftermarkets like these ones were that we were running previous, that they have standard and OC on them. These bearings were never an issue. We ran these bearings forever. So if I could find a set of these bearings, I'd run them. But what I also am going to have to do is move this tang back a little bit if I can, since this edge just barely got nicked. I want to make sure, so our new bearing will set like this in the cap. I want to make sure we have plenty of tang grabbing that. So that's kind of a rough game plan of what the repair is going to be, and honestly kind of a best case scenario. A possible scenario is that's not going to work, and this head's going to have to come off, and this head's going to have to be welded up, and I'm gonna have to find someone that has a boring bar that can go in and basically reline hone. That I don't even, again, know how to accomplish on this. If it was a car engine, I know the avenue. On something like this, I don't. So that's that side of things. And then, like I said, hopefully I can get someone to repair this cam, or maybe find a used cam. I can tell you I've already spent like 3 hours trying to find one of these cams. I can't find one anywhere. Another option would be to get a set of stock cams, which would really suck because it kind of ruins it a bit for me to put stock cams in it. But it is an option. I could buy a set of stock cams, put a set of stock cams in it, and then again come up with a set of bearings and put it back together. But just want to show you guys, not always do things go as planned. It would have been really nice if it did, but with a project like this, you're always going to run into some issues. I don't care who you are. It just happens. This one, hindsight's 2020. I can definitely see where I made my mistakes, and we'll learn from it. It's just one of those things. I don't rebuild bike engines for a living, but I do work on engines. I work on plenty of car engines, and my experience told me not to do this, and I don't know why I did. That's on me. I just wanted to show you guys this, and hopefully it helps someone else learn from my mistake. Another thing that I have a question about, and I did see it on the forum, the other guy that had this problem, is if you look at that shim, that's an aftermarket K&L shim that only has that 20 minutes of runtime. It's already showing some wear, potential wear. I need to inspect it further. But that was the other issue he ran into, is he was getting K&L shims, genuine K&L shims, off eBay. And that's unfortunately where I got that shim. And come to find out, they were not genuine K&L shims. They were just someone putting them on eBay telling you that they are. And after like 200 miles, his bike killed all the shims. Well, the long story short, he went through all sorts of different things, and the fix was to get original Kawasaki shims, and all his problems went away. So it just, again, goes back to parts not being what people are telling you they are, and just really bad quality of aftermarket parts. So unfortunately, I found that information before we had this problem and had this in the back of my mind, but just didn't make the proper adjustments to avoid the problem. So it does give some confirmation to the issues he had, but that doesn't help us, but hopefully this helps you guys. So that'll be it for tonight. I'm sure you guys can tell I'm pretty upset about this, but I'll get through it. There's obviously worse things could happen in life than something like this. It does really suck, but I will figure this out, and I will keep you guys updated. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope this helps somebody. Thanks.